Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we will explore about GraphQL. Before jumping into GraphQL, let us see how REST works, what are the different problems we are facing with REST APIs, how GraphQL is going to help us to overcome these problems. How REST works. In this use case, an API client is making an API call to get the pizza information. REST server is serving with pizza along with soda information. The API client is not happy because the API client is specifically asking for pizza information, but the REST server is responding with pizza along with soda information. That is the reason the API client is not happy. In another use case, again, the API client is making API call to the REST server to get the pizza information, and REST server is responding with pizza along with the soda information. This API client is happy because this API client is getting more information from the REST server with a single API call. If you look at this problem, some API clients are happy, but the other API clients are not happy. The other API clients are not happy because those API clients are getting extra response which they don't require. We call this problem as overfetching. That means some API clients are overfetching the information from the REST server than what they are asking from the server. To solve this overfetching problem with REST, we are going to create granular APIs. Now we are hosting different APIs. One is to get only the pizza information. The second one is to get only the soda information. Now API client need to make two API calls to get the pizza plus soda information. Here this API client is not happy because this API client is ended up making multiple API requests to get pizza and the soda information. But the other API client is so happy because this API client has better control over the API calls. Whenever this API client requires pizza information, it makes the pizza API call. Whenever it requires soda information, it makes soda API call. This API client is so happy as it has better control on that. When we are solving overfetching problem with REST, we are getting a second problem. Still, the API clients are not happy because some API clients are ended up making multiple API requests to fulfill its requirement. We call this second problem as underfetching. That means some API clients are underfetching a response from the API server. That means it is making multiple API requests. When we are making multiple API requests, we are introducing more network traffic, more round trip time. Ultimately, it puts more burden on the network. How are we going to solve this overfetching and underfetching problems by using REST? By introducing API gateways, by introducing client specific APIs. In this case, every enterprise is going to support different API clients. Some of them are going to be thick clients, some of them are going to be thin clients. So we are making client specific APIs, in this case mobile APIs, tablet APIs, desktop APIs, and we are introducing API gateway. We are going to install the API gateway either at the server side or the client side. For example, if the API call is going from mobile client, it goes through the API gateway. API gateway is going to intercept that API call, understands that the API call is coming from mobile client. It redirects that API call to mobile APIs, and mobile APIs are designed to cater to only the mobile clients. So mobile clients are going to be happy, and the same way the desktop clients as well. By having this approach with REST, we are able to overcome overfetching problems, but we introduced new components. We replicated the client specific APIs. Definitely we require more developers to develop, test and deploy more infrastructure to deploy and monitor, and this situation becomes worse if APIs are supporting multiple versions. This ultimately increases capital expenditure and operational expenditure. So this is going to put more burden on the organization. In this case, who is going to rescue us with overfetching, underfetching, and the burden on the organization with capex and opex? GraphQL. Initially, GraphQL specification came from Facebook. Facebook open sourced it. So all the languages, different vendors took that specification and implemented. As per the GraphQL spec says that the GraphQL server is going to understand the client's requirement and it is going to respond exactly what the clients need. Nothing more, nothing less. And it is easier to evolve the APIs over time. So this is the spec, and we will see the same whatever we are seeing on the specification by implementing it. Who implemented GraphQL specification? There are so many people, there are so many languages, other cloud vendors, everyone implemented this GraphQL specification. And in the industry, all the verticals and different clients are already using the GraphQL API implementation in their production systems. So we do have community support if we adopt GraphQL API implementation approach. By listening all these problems and the solutions, we might be having a question that can I replace REST with GraphQL? I would say no. We need to think and decide. Some certain places REST is suitable, certain places GraphQL is suitable. There are advantages with REST. REST goes with HTTP specification. GraphQL doesn't fully follow HTTP specification. And if you have very specific clients and the APIs are lightweight, in that case REST is straightforward to implement it. If you have very data intensive applications, for example, if you are pulling information from data warehousing systems, data lakes, and you do have an APIs with thousands of parameters or the fields to respond, and you are having very vast API clients who are going to consume it. You don't have control who is consuming your APIs. In that case, GraphQL is good. So I suggest rather than replacing, you complement each other. So in any enterprise implementation, you can have some APIs with REST, some APIs with GraphQL. I have built a demo application with Spring Boot where we are going to expose GraphQL APIs and we will see how to interact with, how exactly it works. And the demo code is hosted on this particular GitHub repo. You can download it and run in your local as well. Let us switch to the actual working example. So I have created a Spring Boot application. If you look at the build.gradle, I have included the Spring Boot starter JPA, GraphQL starter, web, and then project Lombok, H2 database, because I'm using in-memory RDBMS, that is H2 database, for the simplicity purpose. So these are the dependencies I have added. If you look at the project structure, I do have entities, repositories, and then controller. And the main thing is the product.graphql schema. So here I have defined the GraphQL schema and their relationships. So I have created the product, and product is having certain field along with reviews. The reviews are nothing but the list of reviews, and technical specifications, again it is a list, and again review and product spec is another object. And then I have defined query. So this is the query I have defined. Anyone who is going to interact with my GraphQL API, they are going to make query by passing the ID of the product to get the product information. Out of this product information, they can choose what fields they want as part of the response. So this is the query I have defined, and the entry point is going to be the product controller, where I have defined just a controller and a method with query mapping. So this is the method which is going to be called when we make product by ID API to the GraphQL. Instead of making get mapping, post mapping, which we generally do for REST APIs, here we are annotated with at query mapping, and we are passing product ID. If the product is there in the database, we get that product, otherwise we return null. And in the application.properties, we primarily defined the H2 database details, and then we have defined entities. We wanted to create tables based on the entities, and then we enabled GraphQL, and we have data.sql. So whenever the Spring Boot is getting initialized, this data.sql will be executed, and some of the products and the data will be inserted into those tables in the H2 database. For that, we have added these properties. Let us run the Spring Boot. So now I am running the Spring Boot application. Once the Spring Boot application is up, we can go to GraphQL. So automatically there is a GraphQL endpoint which is exposed. So GraphQL is graphical user interface to interact with GraphQL APIs. So here I am making a GraphQL API query for the query I defined in the schema product by ID, and my ID is 1, which is already there in the DB. And in this case, I want title, short description, and other fields. Though the product object has many fields, as an API client, I am not interested to get all the response fields. In this case, once I make it, see, now I am getting only the fields which I requested here. For example, another API client is making API call with only 3 fields, and now the same GraphQL API server can return only those 3 fields for that API call. So this is how the GraphQL API works. As per the specification, the GraphQL API server is able to understand the client request, and it is going to respond only that, nothing less, nothing more. As if you are working with APIs, you might be using Postman. So through Postman also you can make GraphQL API request. So if you look at this API call, all the GraphQL APIs are exposed through only one resource endpoint, and we are going to use post. So here we are sending the query. So if you look at this query, we are trying to get ID of the product, title, sale price, and the technical specifications. Once you make an API call, we are getting only those fields as part of the response. For example, I don't require these fields. I want only these 3 fields, ID, title, and sale price. I can make it. So this is how we can make API call through Postman. If you want to use another API client, for example, curl, maybe you can copy this, go to any command prompt where the curl is enabled, you can make it. So this is how you can interact with GraphQL server. This is how you make API call and get the response, and then you take care of that response. I hope you got some insights how REST works, what problems we are facing with REST, how GraphQL is going to help us to overcome those problems. If you have any questions, you can comment on my video. I can give some time to come and respond to those questions. Otherwise, we can see you in another tutorial. Until then, bye.